In yet another futile and hostile move, the European Union, following the footsteps of the US, Canada, and the UK, have announced new sanctions against Iranian authorities and entities in a show of support for rioters over alleged human rights violations. Does the European Union, representing countries in the 27-member bloc, have a footing to stand on when it comes to human rights? In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at the double standards at play and how this will impact the relationship between the EU and the Islamic Republic. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Batul Subaiti joins us. She's a political analyst who joins us from London. Also joining us is Sayyid Mohsen Abbas, journalist and political commentator, who also joins us from London. Welcome to you both. I'll start first with you, Batul Subaiti. We are looking at the EU to have imposed sanctions on Iran over what they have called human rights abuses, which is alleged. They have, I guess, one segment of it has been on Iranian police and security sectors who have been working so hard to try to protect people, try to protect property, etc. And this is viewed, in one sense, if you agree, as a way to undermine the country's police and security apparatus who have been standing up to the rioters. Do you agree with that? And what do you view, what's your reaction to the EU sanctions in the first place?
Right, yeah, so of course, as we all know, Mahsa's tragic death sparked those widespread protests, and thousands did take to different streets demanding answers and justice for Mahsa, which is something expected. It shows that the Iranian nation is energetic and won't tolerate potential injustice. But of course, it's also no surprise that the mobilizations turned very quickly violent. You had armed separatist groups that clashed with security forces. And as you mentioned, the security forces did what any government force is expected to do in that situation. That's to clamp down on rioters, who of course began to pull off the headscarves of Muslim women, setting public properties on fire. So the way that the protests morphed could never in any way, shape or form be characterized as peaceful by the slightest. It wasn't normal. And not because of the way that the security forces dealt with it, but because of the rioters. I mean, it was led by foreign trained spies. And there's a lot of evidence of this. The attacks on Iranian security forces, it enabled terrorists to come out. One of them was the anti-Iran terrorist Kamala group. Iranian intelligence sources also released information about how groups who are affiliated with Al-Qaeda were actually killed by the Iranian military forces in provinces like Sistan and Balochistan after they claimed responsibility for deadly attacks on police stations that killed 4 IRGC members. The IRGC even dismantled arms trafficking gangs in places like Western Azerbaijan. So, it's no secret that the West had pre-planned this, whether they were going to use the title of Mahsa's death or any other title. They unleashed their undercover collaborator networks to wreak havoc in order to exert pressure on Iran in this very, very sensitive period where the nuclear negotiations are ongoing. And the West does this from time to time. It hijacks Iranian people's demands. And this protest was certainly not even as large as 2019's and certainly shouldn't even compare to the scope in 2009. But in terms of the second part of your question on Europe, the sanctions that they had put, we see how Europe is actually just following the traces of America. And it does this, it does this against its very own interests. So even if I give the example of confronting Russia via Ukraine.
What is their interest? What is their gain here by doing this?
Right, so there is a trajectory of Europe following America when it comes to these things. I mean, I was giving the example now of even when it comes to confronting Russia via Ukraine, the European stance against Russia has actually harmed Europe. So it's not even a case of what do they gain out of it. They're actually harming their interests by following this American trajectory in a very blind fashion.
Very well. So, it's interesting, Sayyid Mohsen Abbas, what our guest there, Batul Subaiti, said, because tell us the thought process as you see it when you take a look at the EU and you have certain events, incidents that are tragic in a country, which every country experiences, such as Iran, and they pick this one out. They don't listen to what Iran has provided in terms of the cause of death, and they are disregarding in the sanctions that they've imposed some of the great examples that our guest there cited about these outside groups like the Kamala that she didn't mention, but these are foreign-backed terrorist groups. All those are not mentioned. The killing of the IRGC members, that's not mentioned. And yet they come out, they impose these sanctions, and they are portraying the Islamic Republic as a negative force in all of this. So give us your take on the whole thing.
Well, it's fundamentally a soft power war, which Europe is complicit in. It always has been. It's hidden behind, of course, the Anglo-Zionist empires, coattails. But the reality is that it is part and parcel of that. And now even more so, if we're thinking of the Europeans of having some sort of independent foreign policy, I think you can forget it, because now that they've been cornered into literally being on the front line of a war with Russia, you're going to see even less and less of an EU neutrality, as it were. And what you're seeing here is really just a manifestation of the ongoing hypocrisy of Europe and its general kind of attitude towards Iran. There is an Iranophobia. There is an Islamophobia, which is locked in systemically to European foreign policies. It's locked in systemically to their domestic policies. And the hypocrisy becomes even more apparent about what they're doing with Iran in terms of being so judgmental. And as Batul said very rightly, that they were part of an organized, orchestrated, deep state, systematic effort to change the regime, or change the government, as they'd call it, regime. Of course, that hypocrisy is exposed by the fact that Islamophobia and the attacks on Iranian property here in Europe have been pretty much allowed. I mean, there's been very little police response or protection offered for the Islamic Center of England here in London, which was attacked. We know that people have been attacked in Hamburg. There are all sorts of clear and obvious examples of Iranian MKO operatives being given a free hand, a free rein, really, to do as they like. So you can see that the hypocrisy there is there. Of course, the other hypocrisy is that Europe has a track record of stamping down very, very hard on peaceful protesters. I mean, the Yellow Jackets, for one, an example in France where you can go and pick any number of incidents you like where the actual really militaristic French police stamped down very hard when it was necessary for them to do so. The banlieue riots in Paris are another example. Tens of thousands of people who were marching in Belgium's capital, for instance, and in the Netherlands, and even Austria, Croatia. We've seen during the COVID-19 response, when people did object, again, there was a huge stamping down and a massive police state, if you like, draconian putting down of any opposition to the standard establishment government line. So it reeks of a hypocrisy. The Western and the European particular response is totally hypocritical.
Well, you were talking about, Batul Sabaiti, about these groups that are foreign-backed, that are getting their funds and inciting acts of violence and participating in it. Now, based on what we have been provided, the EU has intentionally actually disregarded and dismissed documents that were offered by Iran. And I'm guessing that that's even as an act of goodwill, Iran providing these documents to prove foreign support for the riots. Why is the EU, do you think, then disregarding it if Iran is providing proof of it?
Right. This whole orchestrated campaign against Iran is in order to apply sanctions in the first place. So someone might ask, why sanctions now? The main aim of the sanctions now is to increase the instability and to provide the ammunition also for the rioters. I mean, even if that's on the level of providing internet, for example, Elon Musk spoke about, Starlink. You have tech firms that are relieving sanctions on access to apps like Zoom, for example. It begs the question of, why now this is happening? Is to sustain the riots. Now, the sanctions are so basically the riots are an excuse for the sanctions, but these sanctions are a means to an end. It's a means to pressure Iran to comply with American demands. They want a nuclear deal, but they still want sanctions on Iran. They want to have their cake and eat it. Specifically now, the US is looking to change its strategy of dealing with Iran since they haven't been successful through negotiations. Iran wants sanction relief. It wants robust guarantees. It wants verification. Nothing outside of the scope of the previous deal, since Iran has always been compliant, but it wants reassurances, and it has every right. And the US haven't been able to pressure Iran or to convince Iran to forego its demands when it comes to sanctions relief, verification, sequencing. And Iran has had the upper hand in the negotiations. The nuclear bar negotiations have been on a stumble block because Iran is not in a hurry to get it signed. It wants to gain the maximum out of it. So to wreak havoc internally, to get riots on the streets, is to pressure Iran. It's to use this protest movement to ask for more sanctions in hopes of even potentially sustaining its and hastening its conclusion, or to get Iran to compromise on its rights.
Sure.
Not realizing that they're actually shooting themselves in the foot and further demonstrating their lack of goodwill and intention. The whole point over here is we will discuss the US because Europe is really just an extension of US foreign policy.
I see. Okay. Well, it's interesting that you call it a protest movement. Sayyid Mohsin Abbas, when you take a look at whoever is out there that is rioting and breaking the law, which includes vandalism, which includes more so, not so much vandalism, but destruction of property. We're looking at these groups that are very clear in what they're chanting and what they want. And basically they want a change in the governance of the Islamic Republic to whomever or whatever is not clear. Given that, which is clear in their chants, the EU is still supporting that, if you want to call it a movement, or those people, or those groups. Isn't that clear interference in other countries' affairs?
It absolutely is a clear interference, but when have they ever not interfered in other states who are not complying with the overall, if you like, international order, as they would say? The international order, by that they mean their masters. The masters are the money mafias that control the banking fraternity of London, Wall Street, and beyond. So Iran remains the only real state which is not within the Bank of International Settlements, isn't complying to the world order in a full and final way, and is resisting on so many levels, on a regional level, and is resisting not only militarily, but is also capable of now resisting with cyber technology. And you notice that they have actually started sanctioning the cyber efforts or the cyber capability of Iran. This is specifically because they fear Iran's capability of not only on a military level, which it's proved time and time again on the ground, but they're also now going to fear that Iran will recognize that it needs a really powerful soft power response. You need an equally powerful way of being able to resist the propaganda, the deep state kind of psychological operations, the rollout of all of these kind of color revolution efforts. There needs to be a much stronger content and substance, which will help to educate not only the Islamic Republic of Iran and its own population, but also the world at large, because we're now living in a world where huge changes during this great reset, which Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and others are pushing. Now, Iran is not totally part of that. And one of the examples I'll give is that Ayatollah Khamenei very wisely resisted the Agenda 2030, for instance, the UN Sustainable Goals role. Now, that's just couched language for depopulation, for LGBT agendas, for more hedonism, more liberalism, and more control of the agricultures and the industries of the so-called poorer nations. Now, Iran has very strongly resisted that, and I think that these things all make sure that Iran is enemy number one. So Iranophobia is not an accident. It's something that's whipped up, whether it's Netanyahu when he was showing his little childish graphs about why they should bomb Iran's nuclear plants, or whether it's Donald Trump, trying to assassinate a diplomatic mission with Haji Qasem Soleimani. All of these actions are basically a desperation. They're desperation of the money mafia. They're desperation of Israel, which is their favorite pet in the world, and specifically in West Asia. And the Europeans are basically a paper tiger that wags its a tail. It wags every time the Atlantic, if you like, real powers, the Americans and the Zionists that control them, actually tell them to jump. Look, for instance, German exports to the US are worth $110 billion per month. That's one quote I had in 2017. I mean, it sold 3 billion to Iran at that time. So you can see there was a no-brainer in terms of Europe going the way of the Americans and doing as they're told. And now that the Russians are squeezing the energy aspect of it and of their lifeline, you can see that all of these nations will fall even more in line with the Americans, and they're not going to let up in terms of trying to really see a JCPOA or a nuclear agreement which really works in the long run. And Iran has already started shifting its attention very rapidly to China, Russia, and the Eurasian axis with the Shanghai Cooperation, etc., and very rightly so.
Yeah, gosh, we only have 5 minutes left. So many angles to cover over here. I got to squeeze this one in between what both have said. It's kind of not along those lines, but again, it gives another dimension to this. And I'd like to ask you, Tal Sabeti, about how the EU has insisted that Iran has been involved in the Ukraine conflict by sending military equipment to Russia. Now, this has come despite frequent denials, again, in relation to the sanctions that have been leveled against Iran by the EU. Now, the quick question that comes about is why would they do that when they themselves have provided, countries like France, the UK, and Germany, for example, have provided weapons to Saudi Arabia when it comes to the war on Yemen, which has killed so many innocent civilians?
Right, exactly. So the whole, I guess, this whole war that is being launched is really just one of consolidating American hegemony. America is threatened by the unipolar nature of the world in which it is dominating, but it actually doesn't realize how this whole campaign against Russia, against China, against Iran is very, very counterproductive for the West, because the opposing camp that is actually bearing the brunt of Western hegemony and sanctions is forming stronger alliances. You know, the US is increasing the list of countries that they are opposed to, and these entities are getting stronger, and they will seek to break the hegemony of the dollar through building those parallel systems and those parallel alliances, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Council, the Shanghai Cooperation, whether it's BRICS, and this new world order is being formed, including Russia, China, Iran, that are key players. It is a multipolar world and will therefore balance out the American fist. I think by now the hypocrisy is clear for everyone to see, right? And the decision that Russia took has to be seen.
How do you deliver that message? As you said, the hypocrisy that is evident to see. How do you deliver that message across the world?
I mean, the hypocrisy is clear on every single level. I mean, the biggest form of tyranny is the propaganda machine.
So why doesn't that happen, say, Mohsen Abbas, when it comes to Palestinians, for example? Why does the EU, first of all, come out, and it's supposed to be part of the Mideast Quartet, come to think of it, but they only come out and condemn. But why isn't there a massive tweet storm against what Israel is doing against Palestinians?
Because all of these social media sites, most of the Western media outlets, whether they're television, social media, Twitter, Facebook, name them all, whichever one you want to turn to, ultimately the hand and the finance and the people that control it in the background are all part of one very powerful neoliberal, neoconservative ideology. And what they've done, what they're doing today is not something that's happened overnight. This is something that they planned at the turn of the century. They said very clearly the American military was going to knock out 7 nations. Out of that, they've pretty much done it to everybody except Iran and Venezuela. I think they're the only ones left out of that system. So you're faced with a pre-planned, premeditated, absolutely calculated attack by the most powerful forces in this world, and they have an ideological problem with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let's not forget that. Imam Khomeini set up an establishment here which has some moral values, and it has a dream. It has an Islamic dream. Whether it's being able to achieve it, absolutely not. They're certainly not allowing it to achieve that dream in the way that perhaps he would have envisaged. But nonetheless, that war, that ideological war is real, it's existential. You see, once you have an ideology like neoliberalism, which wants narcissism, which wants hedonism, which wants to promote all of this kind of slavery of a new kind to the world, you have to have a thinking, an ideology, a kind of a dream which opposes that. The Islamic dream that Iran has been given. At the heart of it, Imam Khamenei has fully embraced that,
right.
and I hear it in all of his speeches. He's very smart, very wise, knows exactly what he's saying, and he is consciously opposing that
Sure.
hedonism, that kind of very, very evil kind of ideology that's coming from these forces.
Okay, final question about Sabeti. I told you time is running out quickly, so I give you a minute on this. Is what kind of response should Iran give, which is proportionate and reciprocal when it comes to the EU sanctions, and how do you think that response should be given?
Right, so I think sanctions on entities and individuals in Iran have existed for 40 years. It doesn't affect Iran at this point. Iran has managed to create a resistance economy out of it on every single level, from manufacturing to agriculture to scientific growth. Sanctions have actually backfired. So in a way, when Europe sanctions Iran, Iran turns those problems into opportunities, and it figures out a way that it can actually grow itself out of it. So it's not expected that these sanctions from the Europeans would affect Iran. What I would say is these sanctions are actually affecting relations because it shows Europe is unreliable. It shows that they don't stick to their pledges. So it's actually harming Europe's reputation and Europe's stance more than it can ever harm Iran.
Thank you so much, Batul Sabeti, political analyst. Sayyid Mohsen Abbas, a pleasure, journalist and political commentator, both from London. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Kaveh Tahwei, it's goodbye until the next Spotlight.